Hi, I'm Dave Maynard, and on this session we're going to talk about archaeology in the Old Testament and the archaeological proofs in the Old Testament. Archaeology verifies the existence of some people, a lot of cities, culture, and just a lot of other things. While it's easy to think of archaeology as an old science, it's a relatively new science, probably around the 1700s or later. And even today's very systematic approach wasn't even used until the early 1900s. In fact, while the Ottoman Empire controlled the Middle East, there wasn't a lot of archaeological excavations that they allowed. It was after World War I, when Britain took control of that whole area, that they then allowed a lot of the archaeologists, especially British and American archaeologists, to come in and really dig around in that area. So much of what archaeology has uncovered has been in the last 50 to 100 years. Now, I'll admit, archaeologists have not found everything mentioned in the Bible. There's so much mentioned in the Bible that they really couldn't have. But they have found a lot, and they regularly use it as a guide in their diggings. So now the Bible is now regarded as a fundamental archaeological reference tool. But remember that not having any archaeological evidence of something doesn't mean it didn't exist. It just means we haven't found it yet. In fact, the late great 20th century archaeologist Nelson Gluck, who is Jewish, has stated that no archaeological discovery has ever disagreed with the Bible. Now again, God has said to test everything to know what is really good and from Him. That's 1 Thessalonians 5:21. I don't know of another book that has issued a challenge like this about itself. Why the challenge? Why would a book do that? So it can set itself apart from all the other books claiming to be either from God or about God. William Albright, the late Old Testament archaeologist, he initially thought the Old Testament was just a book of literature that was made up of a bunch of myths. It wasn't based on historical fact. Now, he was one of the British archaeologists that went over to the Middle East after Britain took over that area. And during his field studies from the 1920s until his death in 1971, he found conclusive evidence that caused him to completely reverse his previous position. And he declared that the Bible was totally consistent with archaeological discoveries. One example of this was the Hittite nation. And in the late 1800s, scholars thought it was a myth. They didn't find the Hittite nation about where the Bible said it was. Well, after World War I, again, after it opened up for archaeological excavations, they found the Hittite nation, and it was pretty much right in the area where the Bible says it was. And now they've dug up a whole slew of information about the Hittite nation. And yes, a lot of that information mentions biblical cities, some biblical people, things like that. Believe it or not, another example was King David. Many archaeologists thought that he was a myth, that he was just a Messiah figure that the Jews had made up. Some of them thought that until 1993. A stone monument was discovered near the Israeli-Syria border that specifically mentions King David and the house of David, along with words implying a victory by the king of Damascus, Ben-Hadad, just like the Bible says in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 20. So now David is no longer considered a myth by any reputable archaeologist. There are so many other archaeological discoveries being found that verify the Bible's trustworthiness. Archaeological evidence has been found in cities like Jericho, Nineveh, Ur, Mara, Babylon, Elbad, Megiddo, Susa, and specifically in 1947, the caves of Qumran, in addition to a lot of other places. Now, my wife and I got to fulfill the dream of a lifetime when we went to Israel. We actually went to Egypt, Jordan, and Israel in the spring of 2017. We got to look at the caves of Qumran. We didn't get to go in them, but we drove by them and we stopped and looked at them. And that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and that verifies a lot of the things in the New Testament. Also, archaeologists have discovered ziggurats, or towers, in the region where the Tower of Babel is believed to have been. And they discovered several of them. So these high towers had shrines at the very top of them, and they were made of bricks, just like the Bible says in Genesis chapter 11, verse 3. One clay fragment found in Babylon, or near Babylon, tells of one tower that so offended the gods that it was destroyed one night and the people were scattered as a result of their speech being made strange. And that's talked about in Genesis chapter 11, verses 5 through 9. That was an incredible discovery. In Isaiah chapter 20, verse 1, the Bible mentions Sargon, king of Assyria, capturing the city of Ashdod. Now, for years, scholars have doubted Sargon's existence until they discovered his palace. And in it was a document that mentioned his attack on the city of Ashdod. Incredible. You know, for a partial list of archaeological discoveries, read the booklet, Can Archaeology Prove the Old Testament by Ralph O. Muncaster. You can also read the book New Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. There is far more archaeological evidence for the Bible than for any other ancient historical document ever written. In fact, most other holy books have little or no archaeological support at all. Now, I have, I believe on my website, I have listed several of the recent archaeological discoveries and what they mean and where they're referenced in the Bible. I've also given you, at the end of your notes, I've given you several website references that confirm all that. And like I say, the books that I talked about go into length about that. There's also books on there's an archaeological reference book on the Bible. There are archaeological encyclopedias out there on the Bible where they show what the Bible says, and then they show when it was found and when it was verified. There is such a wealth of information out there. And like I say, no other historical document is like that. And that's amazing. And most people don't know that. They'll look at things like, well, you can't prove Noah's flood, or really, Jonah was swallowed by a whale. Well, first off, the Bible doesn't say he was swallowed by a whale. The word actually says giant fish. But be that as it may, like I say, we can't prove everything, but there is such a wealth of information in here to prove. Of course we can't prove it all, but we can prove so much of it, and it's so much more than any other either historical document or any other holy book that's out there. So have fun checking into this stuff. I think it'll really build up your faith. And next time we'll talk about archaeology in the New Testament. We'll see you then.